So there are times when I buy a book just based on the title. And I suppose that you shouldn't judge a book by its title, but titles can tell you a lot about a book. Some books have really boring titles. Take the book called the Bible, for example. Whoever decided that the Bible should be titled Bible should get fired. What a boring title for a book. Does anybody know what the word Bible means? Books. It means books. It comes from a Greek word, biblios, and it means books. How boring is that? You'd think that the best-selling book of all time would have had a more intriguing name than books. If God literally wrote the Bible like our more conservative friends tell us, you'd think that God would be able to come up with a better title. After all, the Bible is full of wonderful and tragic stories. It's full of sex and drugs and murder and war and greed, betrayal, music, forgiveness, restoration, and in the end, love wins. And yet somebody decided to call it books. A while ago, I was browsing a bookstore and came across a book with a much more interesting title. It's called Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong. That's a title. That's a good title. So I picked it up, and it's written by James Loewen, and I think that you are familiar with many of the lies he reveals in his book. In some cases, lies might be too strong of a word. What I think Loewen really shows is that American history textbooks refuse to tell the whole truth about American history. American history textbooks, for example, describe Christopher Columbus as a great adventurer who overcame the odds of growing up in poverty to discover America. And already we have many problems. There's no hard evidence that Columbus overcame the poverty of his youth, but more importantly, did Columbus discover America? Did the Vikings discover America? No. Indigenous people discovered America thousands of years before any white person did. And textbooks largely are silent about Columbus's violence against the indigenous people and about his desire to enslave them. In fact, those textbooks are largely silent about the shadow side of all of our American heroes. Loewen describes that none of the textbooks tell how George Washington or Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. They also don't tell about the paradox that was Patrick Henry. You remember Patrick Henry, the man who fought for freedom, saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." He owned slaves. And Henry was a man slightly beyond his times because he knew that owning slaves was immoral. He knew it was racist, and yet he did it anyway. Loewen says that textbooks lie and ignore the full truth about these stories, about these prominent Americans of history, because they are involved in a process of heroification. American history textbooks usually have a stated desire to inspire patriotism and civic duty. And I'm all for patriotism and I'm all for civic duty, but not if we have to participate in the heroification that ignores the history of violently dominating others. Making our forebears into heroes ignores their often tragic and hateful shadow side. It results in putting them up on pedestals only to knock them down when we learn the truth about them. The truth is that our heroes of the past are sometimes flawed and sometimes wonderful, just like the heroes of today. But maybe even worse, heroification silences the voice of the victims of human history. When we only see the heroic aspects of Columbus and Washington and Jefferson, we silence the thousands of voices from indigenous peoples and African slaves all those centuries ago. And when we do that, we ignore the racism that still infects our country today. And so I'm grateful for Loewen's book. But the sad fact is that lies my teacher told me could have been written about almost any culture in world history. People, it seems, have a long habit from the beginning of time of both heroification and silencing of victims. I say almost any culture in world history because there's at least one ancient culture that resisted the impulse of heroification in silencing the voice of its victims. And we find this culture in our Hebrew reading this morning. So here's a question for you. Who was the greatest king in Israel's history? David. David was the greatest king in Israel's history. David protected Israel from its enemies, and Israel was prosperous under David's reign. He led Israel in worship of God by writing many psalms, and he was well loved by many people. This is the story we often hear about King David. This is the story that we often tell our children in Sunday school, that David was the greatest king in Israel's history. And for many, David is one of the greatest heroes of the Bible. But the Bible does not participate in the heroification of David. It tells the truth. It tells the tragic truth of David's shadow side. One day, David was on his roof looking over his kingdom when he saw a woman bathing in her tub. Her name was Bathsheba, and her husband's name was Uriah. But the fact that Bathsheba was her own woman and the fact that she had a husband didn't matter to David in the moment. No, what mattered to David in the moment was that he was consumed with lust and power. David called some of his men to go to Uriah and Bathsheba's house. Uriah was a soldier and off at war. So David's men took Bathsheba and returned her to David. Bathsheba had no choice in the matter. Multiple men forced her to go with them to David's palace, and then David forced himself upon her. It was not an act of love, nor was it consensual. It was an abuse of power. And after being raped, Bathsheba became pregnant, and David tried in many different ways to cover up the scandal that he had committed. But none of his cover-ups worked. Eventually, David made the situation even worse by sending Bathsheba's husband Uriah to the front lines of war, and he was killed. And then he took Bathsheba as his wife. This is the ugly and horrific story of one of the heroes of the Bible. It's an abuse of power, and the Bible says that it was an abuse of power. And it reminds us that the modern Me Too movement that exposes rape and abuse of power is a movement that's thousands of years overdue. Some people might question why such an awful story is in the Bible. Isn't this why the Bible is a horrible book? No. This is why the Bible is an important book. The Bible tells this horrible story about David, Bathsheba, and Uriah because it refuses to participate in the ancient and modern process of heroification. The Bible tells the sometimes beautiful and sometimes ugly truth about ourselves, about our heroes, and about our villains. But the Bible takes it a step further. It claims that David's abuse of power against Bathsheba and her husband had severe consequences. In fact, it was the beginning of the downfall of David and his family. One prophet told David that because of his actions, the sword would never leave David's house. In other words, David's sons would imitate David's violent lust for power. His sons would turn against David and against each other as they tried to grasp power away from one another. Which leads us to our story today. David's son Absalom wanted the power that his father had. So Absalom tried to kill his father David so that he could become the rightful ruler of Israel. And as a loving father, this is David's good side. David refused to kill his own son, and he wanted his generals to deal kindly with his son Absalom. But as Absalom rode through a forest, his long hair got stuck in a tree, and David's generals saw Absalom was vulnerable. They disobeyed David's command to deal kindly with his own son. Instead, they were consumed with this shared lust for power and hatred. They drove swords through Absalom's vulnerable body and killed him. The Bible tells the truth about David. He did many good things, but his lust for power led to civil war, where family fought against family and nation fought against nation. And because of David's violent actions, the sword never left his family's lineage, and the nation was consumed with violence. We progressive Christians often complain that the Hebrew Bible is filled with violence. But the ultimate message of the Hebrew Bible when it comes to violence is this: violence doesn't work. Strength and violence never bring peace. In fact, the biblical story says that when we are consumed with lust for power and we put our faith in violence, we will only destroy ourselves. This last week, I nearly burst out in laughter when a headline came across my computer screen that said that the Trump administration was started something called Space Force. Have you heard of this, Space Force? Well, after a little research, I realized that I was not reading The Onion and that this was serious. Vice President Mike Pence, who asserts to be a faithful follower of Christ, claimed that we need military force in space because, quote, space is a war-fighting domain just like land and air and sea. No place is safe from human violence. He went on to say, it is not enough merely to have an American presence in space. We must have American dominance in space. He said, America will always seek peace in space and on Earth, but history proves that peace only comes through strength. Of course, by strength, the vice president means force and violence. Vice President Pence should read his Bible. He should also read history books. If he did, he would know that strength, dominance, and violence never lead to peace. What Pence said was anti-Christian. It was literally anti-Christ. For Jesus says, those who live by the sword die by the sword. And here I want to be a little careful and remind us that President Trump and Vice President Pence are also children of God, worthy of love. But it is also our duty to fight for peace, and true justice in the world. Trump and Pence, you see, want to be heroes in the way that the world defines heroes. They want to be heroes who use violence to dominate and to protect us from some enemy out there. So you know what they have to do. They have to make up an enemy, whether it's China, Iran, Russia, immigrants, Muslims, the media, brown people, black people, gay people, poor people. It does not matter who the scapegoat of the day is. All that matters is that they have someone to blame. As long as they have a villain to be against, they can claim to be the heroes who bring peace through strength, dominance, and violence. But it has never worked in American history, and it will not work now. Fortunately, Jesus offers another way. Instead of multiplying swords and weapons of war, Jesus multiplies bread to feed the hungry. Instead of claiming to be a heroically violent Messiah who defeats the bad guys, Jesus claims to be the bread of life who feeds all people, especially the poor, especially the immigrant, and especially the marginalized. And those in need of health care get health care. The Spirit of Christ is the love that pulsates throughout space and time and you and me and all of creation. My friends, our greatest hope is not in heroes of violence who lust for domination and power over others. Our greatest hope is in the nonviolent force of love that seeks justice for all people. May we live into that hope today and forevermore. Amen. Hi, everyone. This is Adam Erickson, reminding you that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome at Clackamas United Church of Christ. We are located at 15303 Southeast Webster Road in Milwaukee, Oregon. Our worship service starts at 10:30 on Sundays, except for during the summer months we start at 10 o'clock. If you'd like more information on our church, you can visit our Facebook page or our website at c-ucc.org. You can also reach out to me through email at adam@c-ucc.org. Until next time, grace and peace be with you.